I'm assuming I got an affirmative answer there. Okay, hello, my name's Lydia, and I'm going to be telling you a bit about our research into how people around the world make sense of human song. This is going to be sort of pretty well aligned with Manuel's presentation just now. So first, I just want to give you a bit of a feel for why we were interested in this topic in the first place. So for a minute, I'd like you to just imagine that you're the parent of this very upset and very loud baby, and sort of think to yourself internally what kind of song you would choose if you were trying to soothe them. So I'll give you one option. Hopefully you can hear this. Okay, and this is another option. Right, so I can't really see the room, but I will tell you that most people agree that the first one is a better fit. So how come? You might say it's something to do with perhaps the form of the song, so the tone of the singer's voice maybe, how loud it was, something about the melody, or you might just think it was sort of obvious to you. But if you stop to think about it, that's kind of crazy given that these songs were recorded in small-scale societies that you almost definitely have had no exposure to. But more impressively, this experiment that we just did looks like it generalizes. So we know that listeners can tell what a song is used for, even if they have no experience with the culture that it comes from. So this shouldn't necessarily come as a surprise. We know that music has been observed throughout history and across the globe. We know that it displays a lot of cross-cultural regularities in a variety of domains, and also that it varies more within each society than between them. And we can put all of this evidence together to conclude that perhaps music is universal or has many universal facets to it, despite the incredible diversity that we know exists in human music making. So we also know that music is associated with similar behavioral contexts around the world, contexts like dance, like soothing infants, or ritual activities like ceremonies and funerals. And much like you might have been able to do a minute ago, these behavioral contexts of a song or its function can be predicted from its acoustic features or its form. Now, the mechanism that links the way a song sounds to its behavioral function isn't unique to human song. We actually have observed it across a variety of vocalizations in the animal kingdom as well. So for instance, the frequency and roughness of mammalian vocalizations can give cues about the size of the animal, and these are quite reliable cues because you can't fake them. And so these low and harsh vocalizations would function as an accurate signal of physical dominance to any other organism that hears it. So you can think of these form-function associations as like sets of rules that we can use to implicitly make inferences about other members of our species, or even about members of other species. Going back to human song, you might have used acoustic cues about the singer's perceived gender and age, the number of singers, maybe some of the background noise or instrumentation, and put all of that together to determine that the song was most likely used to soothe a baby and not to be used for dancing. So that's precisely what Mayer and colleagues tested in 2 studies. Another shout out to Sam, who's in the audience. So they put together a corpus of 118 songs, which were recorded in 86 small-scale societies from all around the world. And this corpus consists of 4 types of songs that we know seem to occur universally. So we have dance songs, healing songs, love songs, and lullabies. They then asked participants to listen to each song and select which function that they thought it was most appropriate for. And the results showed that people were very accurate at inferring the functions of dance songs, healing songs, and lullabies. So, going back to this, listeners can tell what a song is used for, even if they have no experience with the culture that it comes from. But there is a bit of an asterisk here, sort of making it harder for us to present evidence for universality. So the recruitment method in these studies relies on participants finding a gamified online study on their own, which introduces some selection bias towards participants who are already interested in world music. And the design and language of the study, which was English, also meant that our sample consisted predominantly of English-speaking, internet literate listeners from industrialized and globalized countries. So you could argue that the results were driven by increased exposure to world music through the internet, or exposure to other cultures through globalization, or just something about Western education. So with the study that I'm going to be talking about today, we're hoping to answer the question of whether listeners around the world can use the form of a song to infer what it's used for, hopefully in a more reliable, generalizable, and replicable manner. So we directly adjust replicability and generalizability in two ways. We did this by testing our hypotheses with two new samples. Firstly, a larger sample of listeners from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds. And secondly, listeners from 3 small-scale societies, which I will get to in a minute. And these new samples and the information we had regarding their cultural backgrounds also allowed us to run some exploratory analyses to see to what extent cultural exposure explains accurate inferences, and also to what extent this ability is universal. So to test if listeners could infer function in unfamiliar music, we asked participants to listen to unfamiliar songs, namely lullabies, dance songs, healing songs, or love songs that were recorded in small-scale societies, and then we asked them to judge their perceived functions. So we used the same musical corpus used in the Mayer et al. Study, so that's 118 songs sampled from all around the world, and had each of our participants listen to 24 randomly selected songs, and then judge their perceived function on a scale that looked like this. So they would provide ratings for all of these different scales about whether they thought the song was suitable for dancing, soothing a baby, healing the sick, and expressing love for another person. And as I mentioned earlier, we had 2 samples complete this task. The first sample I'll call the industrialized society cohort because all of these participants lived in industrialized countries. We reached them via Qualtrics, so they didn't have to find the survey through their own Googling, so that helped us eliminate some self-selection bias. And we also translated the survey into 28 different languages, which hopefully allows us to eliminate certain factors that made it more likely that our participants were all similarly educated, globalized English-speaking people. And in total, we recruited over 5,000 participants from 49 different countries all around the world. We then had a second sample, and for the sample, we worked with anthropologists who were in field sites in 3 locations, and we recruited adult participants from the Nyangatom in Ethiopia, the Mentawai in Indonesia, and Bislama speakers in Vanuatu. And the small-scale society version of the task was very similar to the one that I just described to you, but obviously the instructions were delivered in the local language, they were delivered verbally, and also at the suggestion of local anthropologists, we reduced the 4-point scale down to a 3-point scale. So here we have 3 societies and 116 participants in total. So regarding our hypotheses, our first one was that we expected to replicate the Mayer et al. Study with a larger, diverse, industrialized cohort. And specifically what that means is that we expected listeners to be able to infer the correct functions of dance songs, healing songs, and lullabies. We also expected listeners in small-scale societies to be able to do the same thing. And sort of by extension from those 2 hypotheses, we expected the industrialized and small-scale society participants to use the rating scale similarly and to show similar response patterns. So if we look at the first hypothesis, what we're really testing here is a target song type perceived as more appropriate for its relevant function than the average song in the study. So if listeners can infer that dance songs are indeed used to dance to, then across all songs, dance songs should be rated above the base rate of like danciness in technical terms. So if we look at the first set of results, these are for listeners from the industrialized societies only. What we're looking at here is the used for dancing scale only. So if you recall, we had participants rate all types of songs on this scale, so we can see how the different types performed. And what we see is that the actual dance songs were rated a lot higher on the scale relative to the other types of songs, indicating that participants sort of universally viewed these songs as being most appropriate for dancing. And they also identified lullabies, as being actively inappropriate for dancing. And as would be expected based on this, we found the opposite result looking at the soothing a baby scale. So what we see there is that lullabies were viewed as appropriate for soothing a baby, and as expected, dance songs were viewed as being not used for soothing a baby at all. And we see something very similar with the healing songs as well. These songs were identified as being inappropriate for soothing infants. So here we're looking at the healing illness scale, and this is an interesting case, I think, because in today's modern world, we don't really hear healing songs on a daily basis. But despite this, listeners in industrialized societies were still able to identify real healing songs as being most appropriate for healing the sick. They also identified dance songs as being inappropriate for this function. And finally, we did not find that industrialized listeners were able to identify love songs, but this is consistent with prior work. So the results I've reported so far pretty much perfectly replicate the Mayer et al. 2018 study in a much larger and more diverse sample. And just a quick aside about the industrialized society cohort, the responses from sort of subgroups within this cohort are also quite consistent with each other. So using bootstrapped correlations, we found that listeners in different subgroup samples used the 4 rating scales similarly. And this is actually especially interesting for something like love songs, right? Because these weren't accurately identified in the first place, indicating that people were using the scales sort of similarly, even when they weren't using them correctly. So that sort of aligns well with what I said earlier about how we can think of there being certain rules about form that we use to make inferences about vocalizations. Those rules might not be accurate, but we might still be using them. So looking at hypothesis 2, we expected listeners in small-scale societies to be able to do the same thing. And here we have the results from the 3 small-scale societies for the use for dancing scale. And you'll notice that these results are pretty similar to the results from the industrialized societies. So again, we see that dance songs were identified as being appropriate for dancing, and lullabies were identified as being inappropriate for dancing. And this pattern holds despite the much smaller sample size and also the less sensitive rating scale. And if we look at the rating scale to soothe a baby, here again we see quite a similar pattern. Lullabies were identified as being appropriate for soothing a baby. Healing songs were identified as being inappropriate for soothing a baby. And here you see that dance songs don't quite reach significance. This could be an issue of power given the smaller sample size. And a similar story for use for healing. Again, we see the main effect is holding. So healing songs were identified as being appropriate for healing. And as you might expect, given the null findings in the industrialized cohort, the small-scale society cohort also did not accurately identify love songs. So that comparison should probably give you an idea of how this third hypothesis did. We expected response patterns to be similar across both cohorts. Qualitatively, they do appear to be. And if we look at it quantitatively using bootstrap correlations, we get some evidence to support this. The agreement between industrialized and small-scale society listeners was especially high on the for dancing scale, the soothing a baby scale, but overall we have sort of moderate to large correlations, indicating that the 2 cohorts use the scale similarly. And finally, we wanted to ask whether this effect was qualified by any cultural learning. So for instance, maybe performance is explained by cultural familiarity with the song a culture comes from, with the culture that a song comes from. For instance, you might guess that I'd be better at identifying a European lullaby compared to a Polynesian one. So we wanted to test this using some of the demographic information we had about the participants. So to get an estimate of cultural proximity, we used 2 separate proxies, linguistic proximity and geographic proximity. Linguistic proximity is based on the idea that if 2 languages are more similar and they've traded grammatical structures, for instance, it's also likely that they've traded other aspects of cultural knowledge, including music. So we split the data into 2. So we have trials where the participant's native tongue and the song's native language belong to the same language family, and then trials where the 2 came from different language families. So that gives us 2 groups of trials that we can compare that differ with regards to cultural proximity between the listener and the song. And we did something similar with geographic proximity. Obviously, groups that exist closer to each other in geographical space are more likely to be exposed to each other and to each other's cultures. So again, we split the trials into 2. I identified trials where the participant's IP address came from the same geographic subregion as the song's recording location, and then compared them to trials where they didn't. So both of these together give us like a simple proxy for culturally close and culturally distant. So to see the effect of cultural closeness, we'll look at this plot, which is, this graph is going to show the average predicted rating on a relevant scale, given that the song was actually used for that function, which is a bit confusing, but it's essentially like an accuracy plot. So given that a song was a dance song, for instance, what was the mean rating of that song on the used for dancing dimension? So these are the estimated mean ratings for each song type when the song and listener belong to different language families. So they were culturally far apart. And this is the advantage afforded by cultural closeness. So as you can see here, cultural proximity does actually confer a significant advantage, but it is very small. So over here, this difference is a 0.05 point increase on the use for dancing scale. And for context, that effect is about 1% of the estimated difference between dance songs and lullabies on the use for dancing scale. So what that means is that the effect of culture is there, but it pales in comparison to the effect of the actual form of the song. And now we can look at the same thing, but for the effect of geographic proximity. And you see quite a similar picture here, right? So again, we have significant, but kind of practically non-significant advantages afforded by being geographically close to the location that the song was recorded in. So what these two approaches give us is converging evidence that cultural learning conveys a statistically significant, but practically not very important advantage on the listener. And these results are actually broadly consistent with analogous work in cross-cultural emotion recognition, where meta-analyses have revealed that there's universal recognition of basic emotional facial expressions in tandem with smaller effects associated with judging members of cultural or ethnic in-groups. So in summary, we find evidence that there are universally shared acoustic features which appear to be the main driver behind listeners' successful inferences. And in other words, we have evidence that human song consists of universally shared acoustic features appear to be the main driver behind listeners' successful inferences, and cultural learning is playing a comparatively far smaller role. And in other words, human song has these universally recognizable patterns and features while still displaying culture-specific nuances that listeners can use to inform those interpretations. So thank you very much for listening. And thank you also to Sam for guiding me and supervising me throughout this project.